Hello, my name is Josh Knox, and I'm a Senior Technical Marketing Architect here at Carbon Black. And as your environment, especially your Kubernetes environment, continues to grow, it gets harder to apply policies correctly and to be able to target the exact piece of your Kubernetes environment that you need to target for your policies. And so Carbon Black Container has a great feature already built in to help with that, and it is called scopes. It's right here. And today we're going to look at how these scopes work and how you can set them up. So scopes allow you to apply policies to either specific clusters, which we have here, these are clusters, or cluster groups, which this is the name that you see in front of the cluster here before the colon, that's the cluster group, or a namespace inside the cluster, or a combination of these. And so using these scopes, you're able to pinpoint and target the exact area of the cluster that you want to apply a policy to. So let's take a second here and look at what I've got set up in my test environment. I have 5 clusters right now, and I have 2 clusters that are in the dev cluster group. See, they both have dev on them, and one is named Kate's Dev 1, and this one right here is Kate's Test 1, but it is in the dev group. And then I just have a generic cluster, and then I have a prod 1 that is in the prod group, and a prod 2 that is in the prod group. So now that we've seen these, let's take some scenarios here, and let's see how we can use a scope. So the first thing we're going to do, and let me flip over here to a diagram. I made a little diagram here of these environments. So we just looked at them, and we have these cluster groups that are dev and a cluster group that is prod. And remember, we had dev 01 and we had test 01, and we had prod 01 and prod 02. And so the first thing that the first scope that we want to make is we want to make a scope that will target the big monolith namespace across all of our clusters. So across all of our clusters, we want to have a scope that allows us to target the big monolith namespace. So let's go back over here to the Carbon Black Cloud. And by the way, we're in inventory and then in Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is so special that it has its own a little drop down here inside of inventory. And we were in clusters, and now we're going to click on scopes. And so here in scopes, I don't have that many yet, but we're going to create a few. So we're going to go over here to add scope over here in the corner. And we get we get this new window to be able to create the scope. So the first thing we're going to put in, this scope is going to be the big monolith namespace. And in this case, we're going to use this right here, the applications. We're going to target a specific application in a specific namespace. So we hit next, and here we go. We have namespaces that it is found across our clusters, and here is the big monolith namespace that we were just talking about. We click on it, and we click over here, and we hit save, and that's it. We have the big monolith namespace, and we see here that it is found that there are 5 workloads, and that's because I have the big monolith namespace in all 5 of my clusters. So all 5 of my clusters have that namespace, and now the scope is here, big monolith namespace. It has found these 5 workloads, and so it worked exactly like we wanted. All right, so let's look at another scenario. So the next scenario that we want to do is all clusters in the prod group. So let's go back to our diagram here. And so now what we want to do is we want to get all the clusters in our prod group. So now we're over here. We're trying to get both of these clusters. So there's 2 ways we can do this, and we're going to do it by cluster groups. So again, we're going to go to scopes here, and we're going to add scope. And the reason we want to do this is we may add a prod 3 at some point. So I'm going to just name this prod cluster group. And in this case, we're going to go down to the deployment locations. And you can see here, this targets workloads in specific clusters or cluster groups. That's what we want. So we're going to click next. And now we get a little different screen than we had last time, but we see here we have the option of cluster groups or clusters. Now we want cluster groups. If we do clusters, we'll use this in a little bit, and we can use these buttons to be able to select the specific clusters we want. But if we were to scale out and add clusters, they're not automatically going to be added to this. Whereas if we do cluster groups, and in this case, we wanted the prod group, because this is a group. If I add a new cluster and I add it to the prod cluster group when I create the cluster, this policy will automatically be applied. And so we hit save. And now we have the prod cluster group, and it has 52 workloads because it covers all of it, right? So we have 52 workloads because if we go back to our diagram, this policy is covering the entire clusters. So we now have a prod cluster group scope that we can use. All right, so our next scenario we have is now we want all clusters in the dev group and the secure middleware namespace. So if we go back to the diagram one more time here, this time we want over here, we want the dev clusters, but we only want the secure middleware namespace in this dev cluster group. So let's go ahead and we'll do that. So we go back over to scopes again, and here we are, we have scopes, and we're going to add a scope. And I'm going to call this one dev cluster group secure middleware, long title. And we go to our deployment locations again, and we click next. And we want, again, the dev group. So we have the dev cluster group, but now we want to go down here and apply only to a specific namespace. And we're going to click on secure middleware, and we're going to hit save. And now we have the dev cluster group secure middleware, and we can see there are only 2 workloads as opposed to our big monolith, which had 5 because we applied it to all of our clusters because we just picked a namespace. But in this case, we narrowed it down, and we see we have the dev cluster group and only these 2 workloads. And so we've got exactly down to what we wanted to get to. Okay, so now let's make a scoping for our Snowflake cluster. So we have this test cluster here, and maybe we're doing some specific things in this test cluster that we're not doing in other clusters. So we only want to have some policies that only apply to this test cluster. So let's go back over here and see how we can do that. We're going to click on scopes. We're going to click on add scope over here. We're going to name this one test cluster. And I guess we'll do test 01. We might add more test clusters later. Test 01, and we're going to go to deployment locations. We're going to hit next. In this case, we're going to click down here on clusters, and we're just going to do a specific cluster. So it's only this test cluster here in dev. This is the only one we want to target. We're not worried about any specific namespaces. We could click on this, and maybe we wanted to do the kube public because maybe we're testing out some new settings or something, right? But that's not what we're going to do right now. We're just going to do just the test cluster itself, and we're going to push save. All right, so I think we've covered here all of our scopes that we want to see. Now, today I just wanted to show you how this scoping works. In a future video here, we're going to apply some policies to these scopes, and we're also going to look at this last spot in the scope that I skipped over, which is this container images. We'll look at this when we get to the scanning because this pertains directly to scanning, and so when we talk about that soon, we will talk about this particular option with the scoping. I hope you've learned something. The scoping is a great feature, and it's a great way to be able to specifically target different either applications or different groups or different clusters with the policies that you need to apply. Thanks for watching.